today I want to look at the ways in which an individual can come to terms with decisions made by governments, corporations, and international organizations like the World Trade Organization, and recognize ways to gain control and power, and also to realize the capacity to affect change in your own life, in the workplace, within your family, in the community, in the country, and in the world beyond it. By taking this more human perspective, I will be emphasizing the commonalities that exist between women in the global south, that is Latin America that I'm going to be talking about specifically today, and women in the global north. The United States specifically. Oftentimes when globalization is discussed, it's the differences between these two regions that are emphasized. We're encouraged to think of workers in assembly plants in the so-called third world as having life experiences that are entirely outside of our own in the sophisticated, technologically advanced first world. However, I hope that I'll be able to show that workers in the global south are not passive victims waiting for aid organizations to parachute in and rescue them, but they're able to control their own destinies and save their own lives. So I'm going to be focusing on women, first because I think women shape and are shaped by global economics in unique ways, participating not just as paid employees, but also in less easily measured ways by taking in homework, creating side work projects, and by their work as mothers and wives. I have some slides that should give you an image or an insight into what I mean by that. So this first one is a picture of women working in a laundry in Washington, D.C. And actually, when I first saw this picture, I thought it was very interesting, since the work of being in a laundry probably hasn't changed much in about 100 years. And still, African-American women who are the majority in that work. This is a picture of a woman working in an automobile factory in the Soviet Union. And this just gives you an impression that across the world, not just in Western Europe or North America, women are working in factories, in assembly plants. This right here is some women who look pretty happy about working in an industrial rubber plant in Italy. But what I think is interesting about this picture, I've been part of my research is focused on photography, so I always look at the back. What's interesting is this guy in the corner. I don't know what he's looking at or what he's thinking, but the relationship between him and the women workers is kind of interesting. This is a picture of some women in New Delhi, India, who are being trained, I guess, in some kind of assembly work, maybe in electronics. This is a picture of some women who are actually working in the construction industry in Indonesia, which is pretty difficult to fathom just from that picture. But what they're doing is they're going into the river and collecting gravel for a construction site on those baskets on their heads. So the global economic workplace doesn't necessarily have to be an assembly plant or a production line. This is a woman in Bogota, Colombia, and she's selling cakes there on the street corner, and you can see she's put her baby in a box there. And I think that this gives you an insight also into the kind of work that women do to maybe to support their families that isn't necessarily part of the international economic corporate structure that we think of as being what's notable about the global economy, but women who do this kind of work, selling the things that they make on a street corner, also participating in global economics, I believe. This woman is also working in construction. She's making bricks. That's also in Colombia. So we can also see that the global economy, even though when we see it in advertising and CNN or wherever, and it's pictures of people in natty suits with their, I don't know, their little computer organizers and such like, that's what we think of as being the global economy in the 21st century. But it's also women making bricks by hand in Colombia. This is a Bedouin woman who's selling brooms on the street there. Probably ones that she has made herself. And this is a picture of women doing their housework. Again, I think housework is also a significant part of global economics, because if it wasn't for the unpaid labor that women did, then the rest of the economic activity probably couldn't take place. So this is women doing their laundry in Ecuador. And this finally is a picture of a woman, I'm not quite sure what the country is, but she's working in an electronics factory. And this is maybe more the usual image that we have of workers in the global economy. So she's working in an electronics factory. But what these slides show is that there's a very diverse economy going on that centers around the work that women do, whether it's paid or unpaid. All right. So another part of the reason why I chose to focus on women is because I believe that women, especially young women, are portrayed as being the most victimized, the most passive, the most silenced group in the global economy. Whenever the negative aspects of globalization are presented in the media, the discussions are accompanied often by images of 14-year-olds sewing T-shirts in sweatshops in Malaysia or Haiti. Again, the distance between their experiences and ours is emphasized. And the distance between women working in the global south and how we hear about them in the global north, I think, is crystallized in this text at the bottom here, which is an advertisement that was placed in the trade magazine for the garment industry in the United States called The Bobbin. And it was an advertisement placed by a consortium of El Salvadorian businessmen. And they're encouraging United States businesses to invest in El Salvador because of this reason. You can hire Rosa Martinez for 57 cents an hour, so she's a bargain compared to US workers. And she's much more than colorful. She and her co-workers are known for their industriousness, their reliability, and their quick learning. So we get a real racialized and dehumanizing, I think, description that's supposed to be an incentive for United States businesses to invest in the global south, in Latin America. The statistics that I'm going to show you, these first two are referring to women workers in Latin America or across the world. At least 4 million workers are employed in assembly plants across the world. 2.6 million are women. The majority are young women. So the global economy, as I said, focuses very specifically on the work that young women do. And another statistic, in 1996, 80% of nearly 800,000 maquiladora workers were women aged between 16 to 24. These are the women that I'm going to be talking about specifically today. And a maquiladora is an assembly plant that is usually situated in those border cities between Mexico and the United States. Tijuana, for example, is one. What I think is interesting, though, which you can see in the next overhead, is that there is a very clear parallel between the experiences of women in the global south and their participation in the global economy and women in the United States. I'm going to give you some more facts and figures of how they are affected by global economics. These are figures that are supplied by NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement's program, Transitional Adjustment Assistance. And this is a program that was initiated to provide retraining measures for people who had been laid off when companies had relocated in Mexico. We can see that most of the layoffs have been in the electronics and apparel industries, where women make up 40% and 71% of employees, while comprising only 32% of the US workforce as a whole. So in the United States, it's women workers who have been the people who have suffered most from the effects of globalization. More specifically, it has been African American and Latina women who are affected most severely. While they comprise only 20% of the US workforce, they represent 40% of apparel workers. So again, they are the people that are suffering most from the effects of this economic globalization. Interestingly, maybe for the local area around here, is that specifically globalization has affected rural areas, which represent only 21% of the United States population, but comprise 40% of TAA participants. What happens in these areas is when businesses leave, they usually take with them the entire employment prospects for the next generation of people growing up in a rural area. So consequently, the younger generation has to move out, look elsewhere for work, and this breaks up communities and families, so it has real specific local effects. Okay, so like I said, I'm not an economist, but I'm a cultural historian, I guess. So I'm going to focus on the ways women engage with global culture. That is the media, advertising, and consumer products specifically. I'm also going to focus on a case study of assembly plants or maquiladoras in Tijuana, Mexico. Most of the employees have migrated from the Mexican countryside to work in the assembly plants. In interviews, the women consistently explain the sense of individual freedom that they have found in terms of a new relationship to consumer culture. And so all my overheads really are going to be quotations from these women workers, and I think it's important that we look at their words and recognize that they have a voice and play an active part in understanding how globalization affects their lives. So this is a quotation from Maria Luisa, who is a maquiladora worker. I got to Tijuana and I couldn't pronounce a lot of words. I couldn't pronounce carpet or linoleum or newspaper. I didn't even know these things existed. I was really taken with TV because I had never seen it. I never imagined there could be this little box. You turn it on and there are people talking. And her co-worker, Angela, here I have a roof over my head, food and money to buy clothes. Before I had nothing. This has been an advancement in my life, most of all in economic terms. And I think what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about these quotations is that they're really expressing their, what they see as improvements in their lives in terms of things that they can buy in terms of things that familiarity with consumer culture. So Maria Luisa, you see, learns a whole new vocabulary of consumerism that she wasn't familiar with before. So I think this is an important part of their experience. This initiation into consumerism has negative aspects that are familiar to Americans. The proliferation of global culture is dependent on easily accessible credit, and 90% of Americans are convinced of their middle-class status because of their ability to buy things that they would not have been able to afford if not for credit cards. Even those without credit are affected by the advertising that portrays desirable lifestyles that can be easily accessed through consumer credit. And the women workers in Tijuana are equally affected by the credit trap that Americans often find themselves in. And we can see this short quotation by Anne Haler. She says, "I have bought almost everything on installment." And research suggests that global marketing techniques inculcate a desire for a particular lifestyle that is unattainable for most of the Latin American population. Not surprisingly then, for women like Angela and Maria Luisa, the fulfillment of that desire is dependent on an introduction to consumer credit. So when Angela sees all those things, TV and whatever the things that she mentioned in the previous quotation, the only way that she can have access to them is by getting a credit line. And Angela, like 2 out of 5 maquiladora workers, has a credit arrangement with Dorian's, which is the biggest department store in the city. Credit arrangements in Tijuana give an insight into the vicious cycle of credit and debt experienced elsewhere in the world. In Tijuana, payments to Dorian's are deducted directly from their paychecks, and those deductions are usually delayed so that interest can be accrued. So when they buy things at the department store has an intimate economic relationship with the people that they work for. So it's a very clearly a trap. However, I think there's a positive side to consumerism in Tijuana, which again is a source of identification between women workers in Mexico and women in America. For Maria Cristina, employment and economic independence represent freedom from the constrictions of being a daughter in the Mexican countryside. She says, "Before I didn't like going out because I've always been shy, but now that I'm working, I've changed a lot in my attitudes and in my way of thinking. Before I didn't pay attention to my appearance and I just always stayed at home slovenly and unkempt. I wasn't interested in looking good. Now I buy clothing, makeup and cosmetics for myself and put money aside for bus fare, my meals and anything else I might want to buy." I think that she clearly is relating her sense of individual empowerment to being able to afford a certain feminine style style. Her individual feelings are also related to a more collective sense of self-determination among the maquiladora workers that is expressed in an observation of the women leaving work. This is an observation that was made by a social scientist who was studying this group of women in Tijuana. And what she notices was, what stands out are the tweed pants and the brilliantly colored blouses. Many of the women appear not to have put in a full 8 or 10 hours work. They have carefully made up their faces before leaving the factory, especially if it is Friday and a group of girlfriends is heading out to a dance or to have a drink. I think that this is very interesting because it's a clear parallel between the experiences of women workers in Tijuana, and also if you know anything about the women workers in Lowell in the 1840s, very similar kind of beginnings of bonding between the women workers about things that they could now be able to afford because they were making their own money happened between them. And these kind of conversations about what people look like at the beginning of personal relationships that build a foundation for discussions about work conditions and such like. So I think the fact that they stand out for being stylish is important. Okay. By examining the connections between this kind of female consumption and female production in the assembly plants, another parallel between women in the North and South can be seen. A study of women working in an electronics assembly plant in Silicon Valley shows that employees regularly defy regulations by wearing makeup, elaborate hairstyles, and manicures at work. One worker explains, "At work I feel stripped of my womanhood. I feel like I'm not a lady anymore. It makes me feel unattractive and unfeminine." The comment shows a concern with globally marketed ideals of what constitutes femininity. From this point of view, women are duped into conforming to certain ideas about what women should look like and how they should behave. This globalized image of femininity seems particularly destructive when it is marketed from the Anglo-Americanized global North to women in Latin America who are pressured to fit an ideal that is contradicted by their ethnicity. However, we can see a more complicated picture in Tijuana because women not only buy into, they also produce global consumer culture. These are the women that are making t-shirts, sneakers, toys, all of those kind of things that make up consumer culture that comes from the United States. This intimate connection with what they make gives them critical knowledge when it comes to what they buy. They don't need Kathy Lee or someone like her telling them how to make smart consumer choices and be responsible with what they buy. One example is maquilladora worker Elena, and her job is to make Miss Piggy dolls. That's her job. And she says, "Nothing in the world would make me buy one of those dolls for myself or my daughter. I hate them." Unlike many consumers in the United States, women workers in Mexico understand only too well that the dresses they sew are sold up north for hundreds of dollars. They are also conscious of the fact that those profit margins depend on their low wages and dangerous work conditions. Consequently, unlike United States consumers, women workers in Tijuana do not need to be reminded of the connections between the circumstances of production and the pleasures of consumption, because their experiences of both are predicated on the close association of economics and culture in their daily lives. This is the clear reasoning in Elena's consumer decision. She explains pretty clearly why she doesn't buy the dolls, why she hates them, because after she's been making the things all day, my hands hurt so much when I get home, I couldn't do the housework, I couldn't even change my son's diaper. So her comment points to a physical awareness that parents, probably especially women, can understand very well. And understanding these kinds of intimate relationships between consumption and production, and by intimate relationships I mean the physical feeling of working, and that Elena is explaining there, I think that understanding those connections is a potentially powerful global connection. So I also want to suggest another positive part of, I guess, fashion and consumerism in the assembly plants in Tijuana, and that's this. The attention that women workers in Tijuana pay to their bodies as consumers and producers, that is, dressing up and buying makeup and also feeling the effects of making consumer culture with their hands is fundamental to the construction of an engaged political consciousness in the maquilladoras. In 1978, women workers at Solutron Devices began to actively discuss and organize against a male manager who required that potential employees undergo a mandatory internal examination before they were hired. This was because they didn't the owners of the factories didn't want their employees to be considered to be less than ladylike. Just exactly the same fears that the owners of the Lowell Mills expressed when they feared that women on their own altogether were just going to go crazy with, I don't know, doing all kinds of immoral things. And the same thing happens in Tijuana because, and one of the results of that belief is that they are subjected to internal examinations to make sure that they're virgins, I think, before they were hired. Women who had recently arrived in Tijuana submitted themselves to these examinations because they were inarticulate and disempowered in relation to their own bodies, particularly if a job was at stake. I wouldn't want to say that they were inarticulate when they were talking amongst themselves about their bodies, but when they had to stick up for themselves in front of somebody who was going to give them a job, then that's a different matter. And you can see that. This is an older woman worker, Gabrielle. A lot of women didn't say anything because they were embarrassed and ashamed or because they needed work. The poor girls were 16 and 17, very trusting girls. However, initiation into the consumer culture of fashion and style, together with the physical experiences of working, allowed these women to become more aware of their physical, emotional, and sexual selves. To a certain extent, their consumer behavior and their role as producers became the basis of political action, which led to a strike over this manager and his policy. And ultimately, this strike led to the formation of one of the first maquilladora unions, Sindicato Independiente Sol Diev, in 1979. And I think that that's a very interesting link between becoming aware of your physicality and using that as a means of becoming empowered amongst yourselves. All right, another aspect of this that I think is important is the question of local culture in the global economy. It is suggested that assembly plants in the global south are indicative of how the world is being overwhelmed by the culture of the global north. However, it is clear that in Latin America and elsewhere in the global south, women workers are able to appropriate, interpret, and incorporate global culture within their own local cultures. One example is making cassette tapes. And you can see Anne Haler talks about making cassette tapes kind of in the same way that Elena talks about making Miss Piggy dolls. I felt that in making cassettes I had sacrificed my life, as if in that seat and in that workstation I had left behind something of my being. Again, we see the connection between psychological, emotional, and physical feelings and experiences of work. Part of this experience, however, represents another vital part of the globalization process. Communication with family members is difficult for Tijuana residents, particularly if they are indigenous people who cannot read or write in Spanish. To solve the literacy problem, some women workers send recorded messages to their families who listen to them on cassette players and then record a message in return. So what you get is the things that are produced in Tijuana sent back into the countryside in Mexico and being used for something other than what was intended for them to be used for, I guess. Which is to make a clear connection between families left behind and workers up north. Another example of this is in the Andes, indigenous women have adopted the electronic calculator as a tool in the marketplace. If this calculator is made by women elsewhere in Latin America or by other women in Southeast Asia, maybe, an important global connection is made. The internet is also making inroads among indigenous populations in Latin America who use it as a means to educate, organize, and make connections with other indigenous people elsewhere in the world. These are the kind of networks, kind of using corporations' logic against them. These are the kind of networks that can transform corporate control of globalization, I suggest. Okay, finally I want to mention immigration has been part of globalization since at least the 15th century, probably before. However, in the most recent history of globalization, the same people who champion free trade between nations also scapegoat immigrants to the US for draining resources, social programs, and stealing jobs. This isn't an accident, I don't think. Corporations have a vested interest in preventing workers from organizing across borders, and politicians benefit from appeals to nationalism. In this context, it is useful to look at global commerce and communication not only as an exchange in goods and information, but also as a series of emotional transactions that are integral to the experiences of individual migrant workers. And what I mean by that, I think, is clear in this exchange of letters between Marta Hinones, writing from Van Nuys, California, to her children, Ana Luisa and Olma. Also, Marta's brother, Mario, is also in California, and Olma corresponds with him too. And what you get in this correspondence is a real poignant and almost a desperation because of the emotional feelings that go around the separation between mother and children and trying to keep the connection together. And how that connection is kept is one of the ways that that connection is kept is by the mother sending home things, sneakers or toys or clothes or jeans, to her children back in Mexico. 2/3 of women workers in Tijuana migrate to the United States, 83% of them illegally. One way to maintain connections with families is to send consumer items home. Marta hopes that the money she earns working in the US will sustain her family and pay for her children's education. Paradoxically, of course, the price of long-term economic stability is physical, psychological, and emotional separation. One of the most important ways that Marta can replicate physical proximity with her children is by sending home things that she buys. Correspondingly, her children anticipate the things she sends as signs of her love for them. So you can see that in Olma's reply to her mother, Mama, in your last letter, you say that you're sending some things and that you hope we like them. And I want to know who you sent those things with, because we haven't received anything. She's really upset, not because she hasn't got a pair of jeans, but because she hasn't got her mother there to be a close mother to her, and the only connection she can have is hoping that these things arrived. And then in her next letter she writes, all the things arrived well, the box with all the clothes and a mountain of cassettes again. And so she's, I think, palpably relieved when those things arrive, because she knows that her mother is still thinking of her. Another part of this correspondence is the final overhead here. This is a letter from Olma to Mario, who's Marta's brother. In this letter, you can see that consumer items also become the basis for inscribing gender roles within separated families. Even though he is in another country, Mario is concerned that his role as the family's provider is being ignored. And this is Olma's reply to him. Mario, I want to ask your forgiveness for not having thanked you for the shoes. But as you said, Mama said, just imagine, daughter, I spent more than $400 in total on what I sent you. That's what Mama said, Mario. I thank you with all my soul for all you do for us. So it's clear, I think, from that reply that Mario is concerned that his role as the family's provider is being ignored. At the same time, we get a sense that Olma's mother is anxious that her daughter should understand how much she loves her. Since economic circumstances have precipitated their separation, however, the only way she can communicate this feeling is by giving it a physical shape and telling her it's worth $400. There's another story that I read in correspondence between undocumented workers in the United States and their families in Latin America. And that was when a son, a little boy, had sent an outline of his foot to his mother in California so she could, find a pair of sneakers that would fit this outline. And it really just was heartbreaking, really, because if she was able to stay in Mexico and make enough money to provide for her family, she would have been able to see him growing and touch him and feel that he was growing and see what size his shoe was. But because she was separated, she didn't have that proximity even. So you can imagine what import the little outline of his foot must have had for her. All right, so I think that these letters show that underlying the complex economic, technological and political networks of globalization is an equally complex and, I think, much more vital web of personal relationships between mothers and daughters, husbands and wives, between co-workers and friends that engage yet another vital network of emotions: anger, frustration, anxiety, desire, joy, love. Perhaps this is the terrain where mutual understanding, cooperation and organization might emerge and transform the global economy into a more humane and nurturing global community.